Welcome to your favorite show, Developmental Psychology. I'm your host, Daniel Fisher. Today we're going to go through Adolescence. This will actually be kind of similar to Emerging Adulthood because there's really not a clear-cut line between the two chapters. So it's kind of going to overlap a little bit, but I tried to separate it out so it's not redundant information. But with that said, let's jump into the good times. All right, let's talk about physical growth. We have puberty. Puberty is a period of rapid growth and sexual maturation. Adolescent growth spurt is triggered by an increase in the level of growth hormones circulating through the body during adolescence. Girls' peak rate of growth for height is 12 years old. Weight is 12 and a half. Boys' peak rate of growth is 13.4, and weight is 11.9. Or I should say 13.9 years of age. Sexual maturation. The hypothalamus stimulates activity in the endocrine system, what you should be familiar with, the HPA axis for the stress system, but it also accelerates changes in physical and sexual maturation. Boys and girls have similar levels of both male and female sex hormones during childhood. What do we got here? Let's see here. Adrenarche occurs through the adrenal glands, increases production of androgens between 6 to 8 years of age, contributes to secondary sex characteristics such as pubic and axillary underarm hair. First menstruation occurs between the ages of 11 and 15, and boys' first ejaculation occurs between around age 13. And like everything in this class, what historical period you live in and where you live matters. So there's a secular trend, historical trend in industrialized societies toward early maturation and greater body size. In 1840, the average age of monarchy was 16 and a half years old, a full 4 years later than it is today. Well, I should say menarchy. It's not monarchy. That would be that system existed actually for thousands of years. So anyway, explanations for secular trend, better nutrition, advances in medical care, exposure to chemicals. Americans are taller today. 5'7" is the average male height in 1900. About 5'10" today. 5'3" for women, 1900, and 5'4" today. They're more likely today to reach genetic potential. So the idea here is that because you have nutrition, you have advanced medical care, individuals are able to develop to their full potential, aka reach their full genetic, and that is their full developmental potential. So what are the psychological implications of puberty? For girls, experiencing puberty can become self-conscious about their behavior. Early developers experience behavior and adjustment problems. Pre-existing mental health indicators predict mental health issues during puberty. Late developers are less disadvantaged than boys. So a similar concept that we've seen throughout this course is that a lot of these, development typically does not just come out of nowhere. So basically the idea here is if you're depressed, you have mental health issues prior to puberty, you're more likely to have those same issues during puberty. Boys rate changes more positively. Slower growing boys demonstrate anxiety and at times perform lower on achievement tests. Early developing boys enjoy greater social acceptance but are at higher risk of problem behaviors. Child's perceptions of puberties affect psychological outcomes. So a couple points here. You can see the difference. Women, or I should say teenage girls, who reach puberty quicker than other people in their cohort, in their class, in their school, are at risk for mental health issues, kind of anxiety, etc. While for boys it's the opposite, because they're thinking, oh, these other boys are bigger than me, they're stronger than me, they're more men than me, so I'm going to be anxious. But for boys, the teenage boys who reach puberty quicker than their peers, they do gain greater social acceptance, but they're at risk of problem behaviors. So just think that through. If you're you appear more adult-like, you're maybe attend more parties, maybe have teenage sex at an earlier age, which are all risk factors, especially the younger you are. Maybe drink more, do more drugs, all risk factors for poor developmental outcomes. And finally, the key point is that a child's conception of puberty contributes to their psychological outcomes. So if they believe that puberty is going to be awful, they might be believing that because they already have mental health issues going into puberty, that has a negative effect. So how children perceive puberty is going to go for them impacts their psychological outcomes during puberty. Let's look at gender roles in adolescence. 8th graders understand gender role expectations are social conventions and can be changed, but they also have conceptualizations, violations of psychological abnormality. So what we're getting at here is that 8th graders know that gender roles are kind of social creations and can be changed, but they still classify some changes, some kind of they conceptualize violations of certain gender role expectations as kind of abnormality within that individual, like a clinical kind of diagnosis. Gender intensification, process where gender differences may be magnified by hormonal changes in puberty, increased pressure to conform to gender roles. Doesn't have to be real. Adolescents' perceptions of their peers' thoughts and expectations could affect their behaviors and lead to gender intensification. So there's basically competing theories here, one at a biological level, one at an environmental level, one of which hormonal changes, what we already talked about, leading to acting more quote-unquote boy or girl-like, while environmental changes, especially you see this, well, you see it for both male and female adolescents. But for boys, it's kind of like, act more manly. For girls, it can be stop acting like a tomboy kind of thing. And that can pressure an adolescent teen to act in a stereotypical gender role. And it doesn't even have to be real. They can be imagining these pressures, which we'll talk about actually later on in this lecture. But the imaginary crowd that's pressuring you, even though it's not real, can still have a effect on how the teen acts. In this case, how closely they conform to gender role expectations. So I want to look at one subcategory of teenagers, and that's transgender youth, who are particularly at risk during this historical period. Transgender refers to an individual who identify with a gender other than their biological one. So again, this is kind of a replay slide of how many chapters. I don't know how many chapters ago it was, but just to quick overview, face a very difficult path, particularly because society largely regards sex and gender as the same thing, does not determine sexual orientation. Let's look at some of the challenges for transgender youth. Transgender identity adds to challenges of adolescent development. 2/3 of transgender youth report bullying, harassing, verbal abuse. 40% of transgender youth have been bullied on school property, compared to 18% of cisgender youth. Transgender youth were more likely in 2019 to have been bullied on school property than reported in 2019. So an acceleration of bullying across the last couple of years. Abuses may be perpetuated by parents. Supportive family and peers help protect against abuse. So not only are we seeing increases in, we are seeing increases or reported increases of abuse because it's just reported. We understand that across all forms of abuse, that the amount of reporting does not represent the total actual amount of abuse because people always underreport their abuse. So we have an increase in school bullying, but also abuse can be perpetuated by parents, which is kind of self-evident. However, supportive family and peers help protect against abuse. So if you're experiencing abuse, it goes back to that buffering effect, those protective factors, helping to at least dampen the harmful effects of abuse experienced by transgender youth. Now, I know I usually wait to the end of the chapter to talk about COVID, but it kind of fits more here, so I'd throw it in here. And I found one study actually recently on COVID impact on trans youth. Since the pandemic began, crisis calls to Trans Lifeline and crisis telephone lines staffed by transgender people have risen 40% and continue to climb. So you can see the top of the slide, the types of reporting that the topics that the crisis calls are touching on. Suicide very high on the list, and as well as other kinds of abuse. So kind of again, these at-risk group experiencing COVID, and because they're at risk, they have less resources, they're disenfranchised. The impacts of these kind of large-scale population-level traumas are going to disproportionately impact, in this case, transgender youth, but all marginalized groups. Even though it's a universal trauma, some groups experience more trauma due to their financial resources, social resources, and institutional disenfranchisement. Let's talk about some neuroscience here. Adolescent brain, what do we got going on here? We got the volume of gray matter increases, peaks, and then decrease throughout the teen years, associated with increased synaptogenesis just before puberty and followed by increased pruning. So what have we talked about in previous chapters? Why is there an increase, peak, and a decrease? Many people think, oh, you have more volume, there's more brain activity, therefore your brain is operating better or performing better, whatever, however you want to say it. No, we understand it's about efficiency and it's about adapting to particular environments. So we see that increase, which is kind of suggesting this sensitive period of plasticity within the brain, which is being impacted by the environment. So literally the environment shaping our neuronal connections, in this case, our gray matter, and then declining, because what the brain does, you use it or lose it. So particular parts and subsystems of the brain are shaped and are enhanced. They're, this is not completely correct, but, grow stronger, while the parts of the brains, the networks of the brains that aren't used as much, don't receive as much environmental inputs, aren't being stimulated at the same levels as other teens, for example. They would experience more pruning within those subsystems. So it's literally the brain receiving environmental inputs and then shaping the development of the brain, in this case, gray matter. White matter increases in a linear fashion, reflects increased myelination through adolescence. We talked about myelination, just kind of increased efficiency. It's these neural networks communicating very quickly to perform incredibly complex tasks. What does that mean on the behavioral level? Well, there's a theory that brain changes during adolescence might relate to risky behavior. Brain's reward systems are hypersensitive, that is the limbic system, broadly speaking. Adolescent brain has greater need for reward, which leads to more reward-seeking behaviors, while self-control regulation has not yet matured. The frontal lobes and the prefrontal cortex are less myelinated in adolescence compared to other brain regions, and the frontal lobes / prefrontal cortex is associated with higher order thinking, planning, and decision making. What we're getting at here is, you have this again, these are broad kind of generalizations, hyper reward-seeking neurological system being hyper responsive to the environment, while at the same time self-control regulation not having yet been matured. And what do we mean on a biological level? That would mean kind of a relative, compared to other subsystems of the brain, a relative lack of myelination. Not that they have no myelination, but compared to the rest, other subsystems of the brain, having less myelination, which leads to less kind of efficiency, and frontal lobes are kind of associated with being able to plan, think, and kind of override those emotional responses, right? So due to, on a biological we're talking about here, an inability to kind of quickly override something due to that lack, or that relative lack of myelination, kind of that limbic system, that reward-seeking system, trumping your higher order planning and decision-making frontal lobe / prefrontal cortex parts of your brain. Again, these are all kind of broad generalizations, but that's kind of conceptually what we're looking at here. Let's look at the pituitary hormones in the adolescent brain. The book talked about Oxycontin, so I wanted to kind of pull this in. And we've talked about the HPA axis. We've highlighted the hypothalamus here, but let's talk about the pituitary gland, which controls other glands in the body, releases hormones that influence growth and blood pressure and stress, as you should know. But also we're going to look at oxytocin, which is responsible for a number of reproductive functions and involved in maternal and romantic love. It boosts sensitivity to social cues, good and bad. So it's often characterized as like this love drug or whatever, but really the correct way of looking at this is that an individual, an adolescent in this case, are really just more hyper aware of social cues, whether they're negative or positive. It's not just like this love thing, it's positive and negative. Let's look at some cross-cultural studies of adolescent risk-taking. So one study that I want to talk about is a study that looked at 175 different pre-industrial societies. Researchers discovered evidence for both similarities and differences. Now, why would we look at pre-industrial societies? Well, the idea here is that this is kind of would reveal those biological, those genetic, those innate characteristics of our species, right? Because these are societies that have not undergone industrializations. They may be more rural, maybe farming communities, maybe indigenous communities, kind of communities that are less touched by kind of modernization. So what we're trying to see here is, does our current cultural understanding of adolescent risk-taking, does it apply across all cultures? And by looking at cultures that are not industrial, or not countries, I should say, but countries but societies, groups, tribes, etc. By looking at those groups that are not industrialized, we can kind of begin to dissect the influence and the total influence, the degree of influence that our environment is contributing to adolescent risk-taking. So, researchers discovered evidence for both similarities and differences. All the cultures viewed adolescence as a distinct period of life, separate from childhood and adulthood, in which some restructuring and role learning occurred. The expectations for antisocial behavior was present in only 44% of societies with respect to boys, and only 18% for girls. The majority of culture studies did not expect teenagers to be disobedient. So the notion that adolescence is universally associated with violence received little support. 13% of societies expected adolescent boys to occasionally be violent, and only 3% has such expectations for boys. So as the second bullet point says, we're seeing similarities and differences. So for this universal, species-wide, across all cultures, association between adolescent risk-taking, disobedience, and violence across cultures. On the one hand, violence is not expected. Only 13% of societies for males, 3% for girls. Antisocial behavior, the majority do not expect that, and the majority do not expect disobedience. So what we're seeing here is kind of this hints at that the environment, our environment, something taking place in our society, is contributing to adolescent risk-taking, especially in this historical era. One other study I want to touch on was a study that explored how risk-taking behavior varied as a function of environmental hardship in 77 countries. There is a general trend the world over for people to take fewer risks as they age, and for boys to be greater risk seekers than girls. Risk-seeking behaviors were influenced by the harshness of the environment. In places with lower life expectancy, more income inequality, and lower income levels, people took more risk, and the risky behaviors did not change as sharply with age. This pattern seems to be because living with scarce resources demands more competition, and consequently, more risky behaviors across the lifespan, not just in adolescence. So what's our takeaway here? Well, we looked at 77 countries, and we did find kind of a trend, a universal trend of boys taking more risks than girls. However, There was also a trend, which is also in the U.S. and I think cross-culturally as well. Well, this study is suggesting this cross-culture as well. That universal standard that risk-taking declines with age, which we know to be the case in the United States. But interestingly, and I think this is the most interesting point here, is it's that risk-taking behaviors are influenced by the harshness of the environment. So imagine, a war zone, a country or a context where there are little resources, you're not going to live long, you don't have a lot of money. Well, it's adaptive in that context to possibly take more risky behaviors, because if you just stay where you are, where there is no food, you're going to starve to death. You're going to die. Your family may fall apart. You might get hit by a natural disaster, and you're just left alone to die. You have to immigrate. You have to take that risk. You have to get on that boat and risk your life across the Mediterranean to make it to Europe. You have to maybe steal something, etc. So what it's getting at here is that the level of harshness, that the scarcity within an environment, and kind of consequently the trauma in the environment, leading to and contributing to risky behaviors across cultures. Let's look at sleep. Only 20% of teens get the optimal amount of sleep on school nights, associated with decreased motivation. Insufficient sleep is associated with depression and increased emotional response to frustration, higher levels of depression, irritability. Insufficient sleep harms learning. So we kind of all know this, as in high school, you have more responsibilities, you have more maybe schoolwork, maybe you have a part-time job, and you have to wake up earlier, or at least I did, compared to middle school. And all that contributes to teens not getting the amount of sleep that they need. And what did we talk about in previous chapters? Sleep is critical for development. It's critical for neurological development, psychological development. And we see in the third bullet point that it's critical to mental health. Now, that begs the question, is it that teens who are depressed are not sleeping, or is it depression causing the lack of sleeping? So aka, is it that if you're depressed, you're more likely to not sleep, and then you're kind of in this cycle? Or is it a lack of sleep leading to depression, and then you're in this cycle? And most likely it's both contributing to it. We all know Kid Cudi's quote, the lonely stoner staying up at night. But we also know that if you don't sleep, you're going to wake up, you're going to be irritable, you're going to be pissed off, and you're not going to feel good, especially if you do this over and over and over again, which is what you often see from teens. Now, moving on to teen pregnancy, only 40% of teenagers who have children before age 18 graduate from high school. Teen mothers are more likely to live in poverty. So these are those spillover effects, those cascading effects is how I like to refer to it. You have one big event shift your life course, and then what happens is a series, the probability of following that big event, in this case teen pregnancy, the probability of subsequent events occurring increases. What do I mean by that specifically? Teen pregnancies leads to an increase of dropping out of high school, experiencing more poverty. And we know for Bronfenbrenner that those larger systems, our communities, our countries, our laws, our social programs, our economic programs also contribute to that. Because we know that protective factors, for example, and for teen pregnancy, could help buffer or dampen the negative effects, or the negative, the developmental outcomes associated with teen pregnancy. Parent/child closeness and parental supervision decreases risk of adolescent pregnancy. And look at our risk factors here. Disorganized and dangerous neighborhoods, poverty, lower class, living with a single parent, early puberty, being a victim of sexual abuse and other pregnancy in your family, teen pregnancy in your family. And again, it goes back to that correlation. It's these stressors don't occur in a vacuum. There's no one living in Somalia who's like, oh, I'm only hungry, but I also don't have to walk really far. I also don't have a kind of disorganized house. No, it's a collection of these stressors, and it's the accumulation of those stressors that are most harmful, especially when they're chronic. And that goes back to that adverse child events, those ACEs, accumulating and then harming developmental impacts. Now, with that said, look to the right-hand side. This study just basically looked at associations between teen pregnancy and fetal death, and as well as fetal death from teen pregnancy and kind of other birth complications. Now, just look at the red highlighted lines here. As the ACE score rose from 0 to 1 to 2, etc., odds ratios for each adult consequences increased. Adolescent pregnancy was not associated with any of these adult outcomes in the absence of ACEs. The relationship between ACEs and adolescent pregnancy is strong and graded. So how do ACEs work? Again, just a reminder, and we'll just use the list on the left-hand side, even though that's not exactly correct. What you would do is you would ask the mother in this case, are you experiencing disorganized, dangerous neighborhoods? Do you live with a single parent? Are you from lower class / poor, live in poverty? Did you have early puberty? And you accumulate each one of those that she would respond yes to. They would tick off, and then they would sum the total score, and then they would just look for correlations between that total score and in this case pregnancy outcomes. And what do we find? And this is a consistent finding, that the more ACEs you have, the more at risk for developmental outcomes, or particular developmental outcomes, or negative developmental outcomes. In this case, teen pregnancy, and increased fetal, the likelihood, the risk of fetal death. So again, these ACEs contributing to not only teen pregnancy, but the risk of birth complications. Eating disorders. We have 3 listed here: anorexia, bulimia, binge eating. 5% of females, 13 to 21%, have one of these 3 eating disorders, more common among white American and Asian American women. So we can just kind of look at a few of these here. I guess look at, not read the entire thing, but kind of just overview it quickly. Binge eating, kind of straightforward. You binge eat without purging. Bulimia is recurrent episodes of consuming huge quantities of food, followed by purging. Anorexia is a fear of becoming overweight, so therefore you don't eat. And then these individuals typically feel fat, despite being being malnutrition, having malnutrition, not eating at all, which can obviously lead to serious health consequences, literally death, because you're not eating and not consuming the proper nutrients for to function and to develop properly. So let's look at some suspected causes. The Western ideal of thinness is kind of a large one. Speculations genes play a role, but like all these things, what specific genes, we have no idea, and we don't know if it's actually driving it, or if the gene's driving this behavior and to what extent it is, or if genes are kind of being shaped by environmental stressors, and then so the genes being more reflective of environmental stressors, and then making that person, that individual who's been stressed out, who's experienced a lot of ACEs, more susceptible to eating disorders. Or maybe being kind of a prenatal thing that we talked about, where you're predisposed to eating disorder, a particular eating disorder. Then you encounter adverse developmental context, and then through epigenetics, that light switch is turned on, that gene is activated, and now you're at a much higher likelihood of developing an eating disorder. Biochemical abnormalities, low levels of serotonin, which is involved in both appetite and mood, has been linked to both eating disorders and mood disorders. Females with anorexia tend to be perfectionists, score high on negative emotionality and neuroticism measures. Prevention, family therapy approaches, more lasting effects than individual treatments. The idea here is that the treatment is best should target a family or a community, but in this case a family, and because especially if they're a teenager, you're living in a household with other people, so maybe stresses of the family contributing to eating disorder. So bringing in the entire family, working as a group to develop pathways forward for more positive development. Declining levels of achievement. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon. In middle school or junior high school, I don't know if it's still called that anywhere, but if it's not, that was kind of a term for middle school, I don't know, in like the 80s, prior to the 80s, or maybe 90s. Expectations for success and self-perception of competence decline, become increasingly concerned about achievement outcomes and reinforcement grades than intrinsic satisfaction in achieving greater competence. Students with more risk factors show a steady decline regardless of their IQ test scores, and higher levels of academic achievement can be promoted by emphasizing a growth mindset through adolescence. So let's go over this a little bit here. So we have a few bullet points. Expectations for ourselves, our self-perceptions declining. In children, adolescents I should say, become more obsessed with grades. Those performance goals instead of those mastery goals, that intrinsic motivation, intrinsic satisfaction declining within this time period. And there's a lot of speculation on why that is. Is it the way that schools are structured, educational strategies, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But look at the chart on the right-hand side here. You can see that even when for IQs, kind of quote the high IQs who are performing the higher on IQ tests, even for those groups of individuals, in the presence of ACEs, that cumulative stress, you see performance, their GPA specifically, decline. So these environmental impacts, even with an individual, among individuals who have high IQ test scores, experiencing the decline. Higher levels of academic achievement can be promoted by emphasizing a growth mindset through adolescence. Let's expand on that point here to explain the declines that we just spoke about. Some argue it's related to an increased capacity to analyze the causes and events of interpreting feedback. Do the effects of purely performance goals, education accumulating in children, internalize those cultural values, the educational strategies the culture adopts influence the ways that people think. Schools become more bureaucracies, good grades are more emphasized but harder to come by. Opportunities for choice are limited, assignments less intellectually stimulating, discipline is rigid, all while American adolescents are seeking more autonomy. Giving students a sense of ownership and some degree of control helps maintain their interests and motivations. When teachers require higher level thinking, students rise to meet the challenge of teachers provide appropriate environments. So what we're seeing here, or some people argue that due to adolescents increasing cognitive capacity to interpret feedback. So if you're getting told, F, 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 here, or whatever it is, a red star, you don't get Fun Friday. Students are better able to interpret that feedback and then also consequently possibly internalize that feedback. And in the presence of a culture that values performance goals, that is getting the grade, focuses on just that achievement and not on mastery goals, aka the process of learning, those learning goals, understanding that learning is a process and that a particular grade does not reflect on you on some innate level. But rather, again, it's a process by which you get better at something. But if you're emphasizing the latter, those performance goals, then you internalize it and you think, okay, I'm garbage at school. I'm shit. What's the point? I have lack of now I have less motivation and I have less achievement. So it's literally the culture, the educational strategies, reflecting our larger culture, what we emphasize in the United States, grades, and that changing the way people think. They're changing adolescence, achievement, and motivation. At the same time, schools are more bureaucratized, good grades are more emphasized, and it's harder to come by, courses become more challenging, And this assignments, and on top of that, the assignments are less intellectually stimulating for most schools. So you'll just have to do specific assignments over and over and over again, chasing a particular grades. You're losing intrinsic motivation. The subjects are no longer interesting because that mode of learning is demotivating. It de-emphasizes that intrinsic motivation, that natural instinct to learn, and your whatever it is that intrinsically motivates you. Because it's so bureaucratized, you have less autonomy, less ability to learn and discover interests that interest you, subjects that interest you. So these researchers argue that by giving students a sense of ownership, that is, giving them some degree of control, allowing for more freedom to learn about what they are intrinsically motivated by, and de-emphasize grades, can contribute to motivation and achievement. And that's why in this course I try to kind of lessen the degree to which grades are emphasized, especially at the test level, and emphasize more project-based, discussion-based learning. Because one, I think that learning is achieved more in that kind of format, and I believe that in support of this research, that it kind of touches on and channels your intrinsic motivation, and it capitalizes on that intrinsic motivation, which consequently will increase your performance on the long run. But the point is that it emphasizes that learning is a process, and it makes learning more enjoyable. Let's look at some cross-cultural research. Achievement gaps between American and Asian students. They're rooted in cultural differences, attitudes concerning education and educational practices. Asian Americans are less likely to believe ability is fixed or inborn, and more likely to hold a growth mindset. Again, that fixability. What is the point if you suck at a particular subject? You get a bad grade. Well, that's just confirming that you suck. There's no point. You can't change your ability in something. Well, Asian students are less likely to hold that view. They are more likely to hold a growth mindset. An interesting study asked fifth graders to imagine a wizard who would grant them any wish. 70% of wishes listed by Chinese children had to do with education. 10% of American kids wish for things related to school. So 70 versus 10. Now, interestingly, the most common wish among the 10% was less school. When mothers were asked to state the minimum standard to earn performance satisfaction, American mothers gave a number considerably below the level at which they expected their child to perform. East Asian mothers gave a number considerably higher than the level at which they expected their child to perform. So the cultural difference here is kind of setting that expectation high, but but theoretically achievable. So they argue, these parents, that kind of lets the child know that they are capable of reaching that level, and that they're kind of expected to reach that level, and that education is important. The spread for the average math performance in each American school is greater than the schools in the other countries, and these are among Asian countries. In other words, there are more similarities among the East Asian countries, particularly in Japan and Taiwan, than in the US. On average, the students in the East Asian schools perform much better than the American students, a trend that continues to this day. The cultural differences become even more pronounced as the child continues to participate in their respective educational systems. So our big takeaways here is kind of what we know to be true in the U.S. is that it's not that every school is garbage in the U.S. or whatever. It's that there are some really bad schools, or a lot, really bad schools which are, underfunded, overcrowded, in already impoverished areas, and then there are other schools that have the opposite, a lot of resources, in more wealthier neighborhoods, and have more social capital. So literally, that's what this means. The spread is wider. There's more variability in statistical terms in the quality of schools in the U.S. compared to the quality of schools / math scores in these Asian countries. On average, the students perform much better, and then finally our last bullet point. interestingly, is that as a child is in the education system longer, those differences in math performance in this study are become more pronounced. So as children experience their respective educational systems, that difference increases. That gap increases between the East Asian schools and American schools. So something about the culture, the country, our resources, our educational system contributing to kind of that gap. It's kind of a doses effect. The more doses you're in our educational system, the larger that gap gets. And that can be for a lot of reasons. Environmental reasons within our country, within this particular historical period. The emergence of abstract thought. Formal operations are mental actions on ideas. They mentally juggle and think logically about ideas which cannot be seen, heard, tasted, smelled, or touched. Formal operation thought is also more abstract than concrete operational thought, permits systematic and scientific thinking about problems. Concrete thinkers just go for it. Hypothetical deductive reasoning, developing a hypothesis based on what might logically occur. Reasoning from general ideas or rules to more specific implications. So our takeaway here is that these children at this age are better able to think in abstract concepts, aka things that they can't physically touch, see, etc. And because of that, they're able to think more scientifically. It's not just, I'm just going to try this random thing. It's more, I can approach this with a game plan. I can systematically try things, and I can adjust my behavior and my problem-solving skills accordingly based on how well I perform on whatever task. Mastery of formal operations. Adolescents improve in scientific reasoning with age. 11 to 14-year-olds only answer 20 to 30% of scientific reasoning problems correctly. 50 to 60% of 16 and 17-year-olds correctly solve a scientific reasoning task, and 10-year-olds are good at recognizing scientific reasoning but can't produce it. Piaget believed that perpetual reasoning of young children are replaced by scientific reasoning. Research indicates intuitive scientific reasoning coexists in thinkers, able to switch back and forth based on the appropriate strategy. Adolescents are able to decontextualize, separate prior knowledge and beliefs from the demands of the task. So kind of continuing on what we've already said on the previous slide, you're able to think more abstractly. You're able to decontextualize a problem and separate your prior beliefs about something and kind of approach the problem as is, not bringing in that prior information that might bias your ability to complete the task. And you see this reflected in scientific thinking. But look at even 16, 17-year-olds. They're only completing the scientific reasoning test at 50 to 60%, way higher than 11 and 14-year-olds, but still kind of a long way to go. And our final bullet point here that I want to emphasize is 10-year-olds, they can recognize scientific reasoning, but they can't produce it. So if they're able to understand it, if you're explaining something to them, but that doesn't mean that they're capable of performing these scientific tasks, this scientific reasoning independently. We also have historical effects here. Evidence that younger cohorts are able to solve formal operation tasks earlier and better. 66% of teens in 1996 demonstrated formal operation thinking versus 49% at 1967. Achievement of formal operation thinking depends on opportunity to learn scientific reasoning. So we're seeing a shift because of mandated public schools. So for example, this is 1967, but you can go back to the 1800s where there was no mandated public schools. Those students are going to have less formal formal operation thinking because they're just exposed to less scientific reasoning, less scientific data and problem solving within a classroom. And you can also see this in 1967 compared to 1996. So literally just the opportunity to practice these skills and acquire these skills. What are some implications of formal thought? Well, they may prepare the individual to gain a sense of identity, but is context specific. Think in more complex ways about moral issues, and we'll get back to the first bullet point in a few slides from now. Understand each other better. Questioning can lead to confusion. rebellion against ideas, sometimes losing sight of practical consideration and real barriers to social change. So that's kind of a common critique within books that I wanted to include, which it wasn't as stated specifically in this book, but it's kind of argued by some scientists. So basically the idea here is you're questioning everything, things are more abstract, and you're just kind of in your mind palace, and you're just obsessively thinking about things, and it just eventually you're just like, I have no idea what the hell is happening. I'm lost in my own brain, and that can lead to confusion. And also, basically, the final bullet point is this argument saying that because teens are able to reason abstractly, they're able to identify hypocrisy and kind of the limitations of the world around us, or I should say the injustice about the world around us, that can lead them to say, okay, well, we just need to change X, Y, Z right now, and they're less practical, they're less rational in their models of change in the environment. That's one critique of that. Not necessarily something I agree with, but a common critique that's brought up. I'm just bringing that up so you're familiar with it. So building on kind of Piaget's theory, this dude named Elkind proposed that formal operation thought also leads to adolescent egocentrism, difficulty differentiating one's own thoughts and feelings from those of other people. Young children's egocentrism is rooted in ignorance that different people have different perspectives, while adolescence reflects an enhanced ability to reflect about one's own and others' thoughts. So we have two different reasons for egocentrism, according to Elkind. For children, it's just like literally, I do not understand that you have a brain and you have your own motivations and interests. For adolescents, it's actually you have a better understanding. You're able, and you have a better ability to reflect about your own thoughts, and now you're just kind of, again, in your mind palace, and you're thinking about it obsessively, which leads to, by default, because you're so wrapped up in your own thoughts, problem solving from your own perspective, focusing on your own interpretations of things, egocentrism. All that is egocentric. Two concepts here. Imaginary audience, confusing your own thought with those of a hypothesized, easy for me to say, audience for your behavior. Everyone is thinking whatever is going on in my mind palace. So imaginary audience, you have now convinced yourself that everyone is thinking about you, and everybody's watching you. There's an audience, and so there's an audience that you've imagined, and that audience feels about me exactly what I feel about me. So everyone is thinking whatever is going on in my brain is what's going on in those other everybody else's brain, and they're all watching me. Personal fable, tendency to think that you and your thoughts and feelings are unique. No one has ever felt, thought what I thought, or the way I thought. So common kind of thing for teenagers is, you discover something, and you're the first person in the world to discover it, and therefore you're unique, you're special, and no one has ever thought this before. So those are kind of our two implications for formal thought. So we have inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning emerges in childhood, occurs when specific observations or specific comments from those in authority may be used to draw general conclusions, bottom-up processing. Deductive reasoning emerges in adolescence, reasoning that starts with some overarching principle, and based on that, this proposes specific conclusions, top-down processing, more accurate if premises are true. So kind of an easy way to look at this understand this is look at this chart here. So let's look at the left side, inductive reasoning. And you would expect this from a child. You have your observations, you have your past experience, and you have ideas from authority. And that leading to a general kind of widespread conclusion about the world around us, right? So I experienced that how my mother acts, my friends act, my family acts. They also told me, so my mother also told me, which would be authority figure, that the world works in a certain way, and I've observed the world in a certain way. So all these anecdotal personal experiences has led me to have a general kind of conclusion about the world. It's those bottom-up personal experiences leading to a general conclusion about the world. Versus deductive reasoning, it's top-down approach. So here you kind of have like a general principle, a hypothesis, or maybe even a theory. And then you apply that theory, you can have a logical extension, hypothetical cases. So it kind of reflects more of a scientific way of thinking. And if you have a general principle and you're able to then test it in the real world in hypothetical cases, so not even in the real world but abstractly in your head, you're able to come to more valid conclusions, as long as that first general principle is accurate or more accurate. Integrating work and school. Working students gain knowledge about work, consumer issues, and financial management. Students working 20 hours a week had lower grade point averages, more likely than non-workers to be disengaged from school, more likely to be experience psychological distress. So what are we getting at here? One is that if you work a lot during high school, you have literally less raw time to study, which can negatively impact your GPA. You're also going to be less engaged from school because you have less time to participate in extracurricular activities or a study group or hang out with friends after school. And you're more likely to experience psychological distress. Now, kind of trying to disentangle what is actually causing that distress is difficult, right? So is it that a family is very poor or don't have enough money to get by, so they require their child, so that family needs their child to work? So maybe it's that larger kind of set of stressors that we've talked about many times that are occurring that is contributing to that distress. So it's what degree is it the job, the working, causing this distress, or is it these other factors that is leading to the need of work that's causing these stressors? And it's most likely, like all things, a combination of both. By early elementary school, future dropouts are identified by test scores, poor grades, aggressive behavior, lower class / being poor, trouble neighborhoods and homes, bullied children using drugs. Typically not a single factor, but the cumulative effect of multiple comorbid factors. So another way to think about this is comorbid factors, aka multiple factors occurring at the same time. That's generally said, within colloquially for mental health or psychological disorders, but also can be thought of as risk factors as well. So those ACEs, those combination of factors contributing to a future dropouts. And it's kind of, again, straightforward. And all those things are correlated with each other. Poor grades, violence, bullying, using drugs, being correlated with a lower class and being in more violent, more troubled homes and neighborhoods. All kind of combining to increase the likelihood of a teenager to drop out of high school. And because those factors are often long-term, you can identify some of those factors in elementary school. There's not a lot in the United States, at least in this historical period. There isn't really much class movement. You're not randomly going to go from lower class to higher, to rich. There might be, there's fluctuations, and often, typically now, you see fluctuations from being poor, from being, middle class, going down the ladder due to recession, depressions, and COVID. But typically, historically, those are kind of stable. So that's why you're able to identify those risk factors even in elementary school. Let's talk about psychosocial development and first self-concept. So adolescents at this period are less physical and more psychological when they describe themselves. So instead of saying, "Who are you?" they'll say, instead of saying, "I have brown eyes," they'll say, "I'm very sad," or "How are you?" or define yourself, describe yourself. They're less concrete and more abstract. So I love sports, so that very concrete, specific thing versus this more abstract concept of truthfulness. They're more differentiated, accepted by larger peer group, close friends, and romantic partner, different selves in different social contexts. What we're getting at here is that adolescents understand that they are different people within different contexts. They act differently in different contexts. So you act differently in front of your parents as opposed to your peers or your boyfriend, girlfriend. More integrated and coherent, explain they're happy in some situations and grumpy in others. Again, going back to that different social context. And more reflective upon, become more self-aware, think more about themselves, sometimes painfully self-conscious, which we've already discussed. Self-esteem. Self-esteem tends to decrease from childhood to early adolescence. become more realistic about strengths and weaknesses, temporarily unsure of themselves when transitioning to middle school, unhappy with body changes, most common among white females. Most adolescents maintain moderate or high levels of self-esteem over the adult years or emerge from this development period with higher self-esteem. So kind of the idea here is you kind of see a dip in self-esteem, which may be related to shifting schools, body changes, and also kind of the fact that, as a kid, you can ask a 4 or 5-year-old, hey, are you capable of going on an NFL field right now and winning the Super Bowl? And they'd be like, hell yeah, I'm going to dominate the Super Bowl. Or are you capable of doing trigonometry? And they'll be like, yep, I'm ready to rock and roll. But as you become to better understand yourself, you understand your strengths and weaknesses, going back to that metacognition, and you're able to be more accurate in your abilities, which possibly may contribute to that initial decline in self-esteem. Let's talk about one of Erikson's stages real quick, and that is forging an identity. Adolescence is a critical period in the lifelong process of forming identity as a person, identity versus role confusion. Adolescents ask who they are and must establish social and vocational identities. Otherwise, they'll remain confused about the roles they should play as adults. Adolescents must integrate varied perceptions of the self-concept into a coherent sense of self. What kind of career do I want? Where do I fit in? So you're kind of going through this identity crisis. You're trying to define yourself. Where do I fit in society? What are my abilities? Who am I? Adolescents may experience an identity crisis. Revision of body image, adjust to being sexual beings, cognitive growth allows for thinking about the self, social demands require them to grow up. Society supports youth by allowing them a moratorium period, which we're going to get to momentarily. But basically, our point here is that we have identity crisis due to these physical changes, these cognitive changes, these sexual changes, and these social requirements due to their increased age. So they're expected to act in more mature ways, which contributes to this identity crisis because they have to figure out how do I act and in what roles in society will I come to adopt, and how are my strengths and weaknesses, what role in society are best for my particular strengths and weaknesses. Forging identity, Marcia, that's this dude right here. He argued that adolescents are classified into one of 4 identity statuses based on their progress toward an identity in each of several domains. And there's a bunch of domains. So, for example, occupational, religious, political, etc. The key questions are whether an individual has experienced a crisis, aka are seriously grappled with identity issues and explored alternatives, and achieved a commitment, resolved the questions raised, and settled on an identity. Only 5% of adolescents were in the same identity status in all 4 areas. So we have different areas of identity, and we see kind of development, progress in identity formation through two steps here that are required. You have to experience a crisis, so you have to literally ask yourself, oh, what religion am I? And then you have to ultimately come to a conclusion, which is aka achieve the commitment, which resolves whatever religion or religious views you have. And just because you're achieved identity in one domain does not mean you have achieved an identity on all domains. Adolescents vary in the degree to which they've established their identities across all the domains. So identity statuses. There's diffusion status, which occurs between 12 and 15 years of age. There's no crisis, no commitment, haven't really thought about who they are. So we're kind of walking through here how it is we get to eventually identity achievement. So, at a certain age, you haven't even thought about it. There's no crisis, there's no commitment. You have foreclosure status, which is accepting identity suggested to them by their parents or peers, a commitment without a crisis. So here, you're committed to an identity, but you really haven't gone through, wait, is this who really I am? It's just, you've been told that this is who you are and you accept it. Moratorium status, 18 years old, experiencing a crisis and actively exploring identity, religion, drugs, majors, posting online, whatever. So the idea here is that society kind of gives some 18-year-olds, I should say, because most people do not have a bachelor's degree, for example. The overwhelming majority don't. But there's some degree of moratorium status in college, and also kind of an understanding among your family that you're in this moratorium status. They don't really call it that, but they have an understanding that you're questioning who you are and you're exploring who you are as a person. And then finally, identity achievement involves not only raising questions, but answering them. 20% of 18-year-olds, 40% of college students, 50% of 24-year-olds. So even at 24 years old, only 50% of 24-year-olds are achieving identity achievement across these domains. So again, so you can see that this is a long process, and it's not a linear process. Some people think they have something figured out, and then they actively explore again and re-question themselves. And here you can see a chart on the right-hand side, kind of the trajectory of kind of the 4 statuses that exist for identity formation. So these are just some of the identity development domains, and we're just going to touch on a few of them. Let's look at ethnic identity. An important aspect of identity is forging an ethnic identity. How people come to terms with who they are based on their ethnicity or racial ancestry. It's a personal identification with the ethnic group and its values in cultural traditions. It begins in infancy. Adolescents proceed through the same identity statuses as they do in forming other identities. Positive ethnic identity serves to buffer against racial and ethnic discrimination. So kind of our takeaway here is that where an individual is trying to figure out who they are, come to terms with their ethnic and racial ancestries, which involves adopting certain values, cultural traditions, etc. It begins early on, and successful achievement of an ethnic identity can buffer the negative impacts of racial and ethnic discrimination, kind of, again, hamper the negative effects. They can buffering is kind of like the blood-brain or the placental barrier. It can limit some of negative harmful effects to the fetus in that case, but to an individual here, if you have a whole society against you, it's difficult, but it does provide partial protection, or it's maybe in some individuals full protection depending on other resources they're bringing to the table. Let's look at Finney's model of ethnic identity. And this is actually pretty similar to what we've already talked about. So let's look at unexamined ethnic identity. Adolescents and adults who have not been exposed to ethnic identity issues. So kind of that's similar to that period of not really even thinking about it yet, not really exploring it. In this case, an individual has a preference for the dominant culture, or where the individual has given little thought to the question of their ethnic heritage. So they're kind of just chilling, they're existing, they're haven't really thought about their ethnic identity, or they have a preference for the dominant culture. Ethnic identity search, adolescents and adults who are exploring their customs, culture, and history of their ethnic groups are in the ethnic identity search stage. Some events, quote, awakens a teen or adult to their ethnic group, either a personal experience with prejudice, a highly profiled case in the media, or a positive event that recognizes the contribution of someone from their individual's ethnic group. So kind of this exploration stage. So now we're questioning things, we're exploring things, and it may be in the environment contributes to this status occurring. So either a negative event, death, a killing, an act of racial or gendered event that's unjust, an ableist event, etc., or some kind of tragedy or injustice against a lower class / a poor person, kind of leading to that awakening. I'm now beginning to question society, myself, who am I? Or maybe somebody in your group, in this case ethnic group, contributing to that awakening period where you then explore, as I stated. And then finally, achieved ethnic identity, having a deeper appreciation and understanding of their ethnic heritage, leading to progress toward an achieved ethnic identity. does not necessarily imply that the individual is highly involved in the customs and values of their ethnic culture, can be confident in their ethnic identity without wanting to maintain the language of their customs. So the point here is you achieve something. You've resolved you've questioned, you've explored, and now you've resolved that crisis in your own way. That doesn't necessarily mean adopting XYZ values or cultural customs, but that you've resolved that crisis, and now you have your own identity, your ethnic identity, I should say. Continuing with ethnic identity, ethnic minorities must wrestle with the question of how and to what extent they will identify with the culture of the surrounding society and with the culture of their family. Some individuals are bicultural, which individuals see himself or herself as part of both the ethnic minority group and the larger society. There are also multiracial identities, whose parents come from two or more ethnic or racial groups, and may have a more challenging identity formation in cultures that emphasize race. So in a more racially conscious / racist society, or a caste society, or just any individuals that, or any society that emphasizes the ethnic groups, people who are in multi-groups are going to have a more difficult time, navigating that society. And then finally, negative identity, which is the adoption of norms and values that are opposite of one's family and culture. Hold dichotomous beliefs and consequently divide the world into two categories, friend or foe, good or bad. Cannot integrate information and beliefs that exist in both their inner and outer worlds. Generally hostile and cynical towards society, often because they do not trust the world around them. So here these individuals are more likely to have kind of been just abused by society, maybe have also rough relationships with their parents and their family, or kind of their culture in general, and they are kind of just obstinate. They're holding opposite views. They can't really achieve an identity. They're hostile towards everyone. They're cynical about society, and they're struggling. They're in pain, and they don't trust the world around them. They're often lonely, and this negative identity is actually the kind of the identity that's most associated with poor developmental outcomes. Vocational identity and choice. Individuals search for an optimal fit between one personality and occupation. A person-environmental fit is kind of like goodness of fit. So the idea here is, now I know who I am, I know my personality is, I know my strengths, I know my weaknesses, and I want to select an environment that matches my personality. That's like goodness of fit, matching who I am with my environment. And there are a bunch of different kind of components of vocational identity: investigative, social, realistic, artistic, conventional, and enterprising. So if I'm super artistic, my best person environment fit. My best goodness of fit would be whatever, a painter or a graphic artist or something along those lines. And the same holds true for the rest of these components of vocational identity. Barriers to vocational choice. Adolescents begin to take into account the realities of the job market and the physical and economic or educational requirements. Poorer children face limited opportunities and barriers to occupations which match their personality. They may aim high at first, but as they become more aware of the constraints on their choices, they lower their aspirations and aim towards jobs they think they can get rather than jobs which interest them. Women often have to choose careers they think will make it easier for them to combine work and family. How might this play out in low-income / post-colonial countries? So our big takeaways here are, obviously we all understand or are likely to have some knowledge of our person environment fit, that goodness of fit, what jobs best match our strengths, our weaknesses, our interests. But the reality on the ground is, or we begin to understand the reality on the ground. We might live in a poor country. We might live in a poor neighborhood. There may be structural impediments to achieving or accessing that job opportunity. So specifically for poor children, they may live in an area where there is no, say they're really interested in accounting, or I don't know. Yeah, we'll just stick with accounting here, or being a chef or something. I don't know. And there are no chef schools in that area or where they live in their neighborhood. There are no large accounting firms in that area, and they can't access other neighborhoods where those firms might be because of travel restrictions, family restrictions, and just lack of resources that prevent them from reaching and accessing the educational requirements to work at that job or to physically access that job at all. And you also see an effect among women who are often far less so now, but are typically historically tasked with raising children. So they have to balance that the needs of their family and their needs of their work. And this obviously is also going to have a historical influence as well. So, fun fact for me, I graduated with my PhD as a doctor in 2020. Great year, so that's a barrier that existed to my employment for those individuals who graduated during the Great Recession, which also I did as an undergraduate. Also barriers to your career. So you can see that the levels, those macro system levels, contributing to barriers. Another example, the Great Depression, for example. Having no jobs will limit your ability to access and to work in jobs that best match your personality, your strengths, your weaknesses. That goodness of fit is decreased in those situations, in those historical periods. Moral identity. Teens come to view being a moral person who is caring for and honest as a central part of who they are. Adolescents who develop a sense of moral terms tend to be more capable of advanced moral reasoning, especially something in the situation reminds them of their moral values. They are more likely to act morally than adolescents who do not define themselves in moral terms. Development of moral identity can be fostered by parents, induction or occasional disappointment rather than power assertion or love withdrawal, fostered via involvement in community service and other pro-social activities. So what we're getting at here is adolescents want to view themselves as moral. They're not these subhuman, deviant creatures. They want to view themselves as moral creatures, as moral individuals, and among adolescents who develop a strong sense of moral identity, they're more likely to act on their moral values in circumstances and situations that remind them of what they know about their moral identity. And moral identity development can be fostered by parents and by participating in pro-social, kind of those community activities. It fosters the development of moral identity. So the environment shaping who we are, in this case, our moral identity. Changes in moral reasoning. 10-year-olds, pre-conventional reasoning. Rules are external to the self rather than internalized. So this is kind of going back to those Kohlberg stages of morality, the moral reasoning, and those Piaget stages of reasoning. In teen years, conventional reasoning dominate mode of moral thinking. They've internalized many moral values, show respect for the rules set by others at first to win their approval, later to maintain social order. So we got little kids who are just like, rules are external, they exist outside of me, and they, whatever, are set in stone, and punishments and rewards are kind of driving my behavior. That's what my morality is based around. Versus teen years, where you've kind of now internalized these moral values, you're not just worried about punishment, but you've still kind of just accepted the rules, the morality of your culture without really having to think it through. So you show respect for those rules to win at first kind of the approval of your parents or society at large, but also eventually you kind of rationalize it and say, okay, I need to internalize these rules because without these rules, society is going to collapse and there's going to be social order is going to be collapsed and then there's going to be chaos in the streets. Versus adulthood, post-conventional reasoning, if it emerges at all. What is right in terms of broad principles of justice, which we've already talked about. So if post-conventional reasoning, this idea that there are larger, morality is based on these larger, almost above human principles At times that is religious, at other times it's secular, but these things that are larger than the individual, these ideas of justice, driving my morality, my moral reasoning. That is most likely to occur in adulthood if that type of morality just develops at all within an individual. Antisocial behavior. The quality of antisocial behavior changes from childhood to adolescence. Physical aggression decreases, while non-aggressive rule breaking such as theft and vandalizing increases. Juvenile delinquency is law breaking by a minor. Some diagnosed with conduct disorder. Persistent patterns of violating the rights of others or age-appropriate societal norms such as fighting, bullying, and cruelty. So we're seeing a decrease in violence to more, again, kind of theft and vandalism. And those that show chronic rule breaking and kind of specific types of rule breaking are the children who get diagnosed, and one diagnosis is conduct disorder. Two subgroups of antisocial use. Early onset, which are seriously disturbed group that is recognized in childhood. This is kind of the classic Dexter phenomenon, I should say, from the, what was that on? Was that on Showtime, Stars? I don't know. Whatever Dexter was on. Hurting animals, hurting others and animals, and persistently antisocial across the lifespan. Later onset, which is less seriously antisocial group that behaves more antisocially during adolescence, and you outgrow it. So the idea here is if you're starting early, if you're torturing things at an early age, you're more likely to be at risk for like chronic, lifelong antisocial behavior versus kind of like the general antisocial behavior that you see as adolescents that are less serious, vandalism, that you do a few times or whatever, and then you kind of just grow out of it. Let's talk about some theories of aggressive youth. Dodge's social information processing model is one way we can understand aggressive youth. Our reactions to frustration, anger, and provocation depend on the ways in which we process, interpret cues and situations. Aggressive youths develop a hostile attribution bias. Deficient or biased information processes see the world as a hostile place and quickly assume that any harm to them was deliberate rather than accidental. Severely violent youths often experience abandonment, neglect, abuse, bullying. They may have given them some cause to view the world as a hostile place and to feel justified in retaliating against individuals they believe are out to get them. So the idea here is that kind of things that are kind of just annoying to you that happen sometimes. You're walking on the street, you accidentally, in a busy city, I've lived in Scotland, in Edinburgh, for example. It can be then they always hold these festivals and you bump into people constantly. Well, I'm not interpreting that bumping as this person wants to fist fight me in the middle of this art festival. But in contrast, an aggressive youth may hold a hostile attribution bias. That is, they would interpret that bumping into somebody as, oh, this person is trying to come at me, he's attacking me, this is not an accident. They're trying, and they kind of have that worldview of the world's out to get them, so before the world gets me, I'm going to get them. So that's a particular kind of information processing that allows and makes more likely that you're going to be aggressive with an individual. You're literally interpreting the world around you in a hostile way. Let's look at another model here, Patterson's corrosive family environments. Highly antisocial children and adolescents often grow up in coercive family environments. Family members are locked in power struggles and are trying to control each other through negative, corrosive tactics. Children learn that they can get their parents to lay off them by ignoring requests, whining, massive temper tantrums. As both parents and children learn to rely on coercion to avoid or escape unpleasant encounters, parents lose control over their parents or their children's behaviors. Spankings have no effect anymore. An already aggressive child performs poorly in school and is rejected by other children. They join peer groups who are typically low-achieving, antisocial. So all this basically means is a highly antisocial child who's had a long persistence of antisocial behavior probably grew up or are more likely to grow up in a coercive environment. Family members are not really talking through why they do things. They're more likely to be authoritarian, harsh parenting, and kind of just in a constant power struggle against each other. Not seeking to compromise, not seeking to understand each other or come to solutions. Thus, they are relying on coercive, negative kind of strategies in this power struggle for dominance. It's a winner-take-all kind of family environment, which is obviously very unhealthy for not only the parents but also a developing child. And then eventually, and parents in those circumstances are more likely to rely on physical coercion, such as spanking, but eventually spanking no longer plays it doesn't deter any behavior, and then the child now is just unrestrained, and they have no parental support, their family environment is toxic. Then those children either enter school, they're going to be rejected by their peers because they really haven't developed any pro-social behavior. They don't know how to act among their peers in a non-aggressive way. Therefore, those children are rejected, and then they join other children who come from similar background, and then they're just interacting with themselves, and they become even more antisocial, and then you're just, it's a cascading effect here. Let's move on from deviant behavior and kind of wrap up our self-concept understanding among adolescents. So who am I / a 20 statements test. So this is a study that asks individuals basically, who are you? They provide you with literally a list of the words I am, and then a blank line, and you write what it is you are. So I am a professor. I am pretty damn good at NBA 2K21, etc. So you have 20 of I am, 20 lines of I am, and then a blank line, and you fill it out. Okay. Well, this test has been administered cross-culturally. And specifically, a study of Kenyans and American undergraduate students took it in this study. Kenyan participants into groups that should theoretically vary in terms of how much they were exposed to Western cultural ways. Kenyan university students in Nairobi should be the most westernized group in their sample. Educational system was shaped by the British colonial past. Employed adults in Nairobi might be slightly less westernized, and traditional indigenous Kenyan groups, such as the Samburu and the Maasai, would be the least westernized. So the idea here is not only was there a Kenyan and American group, the Kenyan group was subdivided into 3 groups. We have the university students, who are going to be most exposed to westernized education and culture. We have the employed individuals in Nairobi. Nairobi is kind of a big city, so you're going to be exposed to some westernization, but you're probably for this sample specifically, kind of less encountered Western education. So you have less Western exposure. And then traditional indigenous Kenyan groups such as the Maasai and Samburu, and they're the least westernized. And actually, that is the Maasai in this photo right here, and that is me at 19 years old. So so it's not true for all of the members of the Maasai, but in this study, they selected Maasai individuals who kind of stood within their cities and who would be exposed to the least amount of Western influence. Well, most frequent self-descriptions for the Americans were personal characteristics such as their trait, attitudes, and abilities. 48% of their statements. So literally, I am good at 2K, I am fast, I am whatever. So these specific traits, attitudes, and abilities. That was 48% of American undergraduate students' responses. Those type of statements, however, were only made up less than 2% of the Maasai and Samburu self-descriptions. Their responses generally reflected their social identity. Their roles and memberships accounted for more than 60% of their statements, while compared to Americans, those types of statements were only 7% of American descriptions. So what are we getting at here is that cultural differences matter. They affect your personality, how you describe your personality, how you describe yourself. What is your self-concept? Well, it depends on your culture. For the Maasai, it reflects their social identity, their role, their membership in society. That is what they hold closest to them as part of their identity. While in the United States, that only represented 7% of their self-descriptions. So you see that individual culture versus that collective, social collectivist culture. Now, of course, Americans do sometimes think of themselves in terms of social identity, and Maasai and Samburu sometimes consider their own personality traits. And you can see this across the United States. So it's not just American undergraduate students. I've talked about in this class that that is also a weird sample. The majority of individuals are not in university undergraduate students. But, regardless, there are differences that do exist across cultures. But the key here is it's the degree to which people from these cultures consider these different aspects of themselves. So it's not that they're incapable or that Americans are incapable of these social identities or Maasai of individual identities. It's just that the degree to which they emphasize them and define themselves in those terms varies. The other two Kenyan groups fell in between, with the university students being closer to the American pattern and the workers more closely resembling to the Maasai and Samburu patterns. So again, that continuum, university students being closer to the American university students and the workers in Nairobi being closer to the Maasai, that collectivist understanding. And you can see that in the chart. So university students being close together and the workers and the Maasai and Samburu tribes being describing themselves in most similarly describing themselves. Attachment to parents. So everybody always talks about attachment as an infant, as a young child, but let's talk about attachment among adolescents. Well, adolescents need the security and encouragements to explore, to become independent and autonomous individuals, provided by supportive parents. Adolescents with secure parent-child attachments have a stronger sense of identity, greater social competence, better emotional adjustments, fewer behavioral problems, and form higher quality attachments to friends and later romantic partners than adolescents with insecure attachments to their parents. And that's within a United States context, and that's generally speaking. Obviously, there are variations there. But the idea here is having the security and the encouragement of parents is critical, even among adolescents, for a host of reasons, as I just detailed. Continuing on, most parent-child relationships are close. It's rare for the parent-child relationship to suddenly turn bad. Troubled parent-adolescent relationship has grown out of a troubled parent-child relationship. Conflict increases temporarily during puberty, mainly about minor matters, homework, chores, disobedience. Adolescents spend more time with peers. So again, this kind of goes back to what we talked about before. These things don't just come out of nowhere. An adolescent is at risk for having, or higher risk for having, kind of a poor relationship with their parents if they had a poor relationship with their parent as a child. These things bleed over. It's not just a magical age and then boom, we have a new relationship. And conflict does increase, but it's about temporary matters in general. It's not these big, catastrophic, drama-filled events that is typically and historically been portrayed in the media. As I just stated, parental adolescent attachment is important for achieving autonomy. And why is that important? Because it's a key developmental task during adolescence. Parents give up some of their power, adolescents assume more control of their lives, and the parent-child relationship becomes more equal. How much autonomy does adolescents want and how much parents grant differ across cultures. Authoritative parenting style gives adolescents opportunities to strengthen their independent decision-making skills while retaining the benefits of their parents' guidance. Authoritarian and more permissive styles produce acceptable outcomes in some cultures. So the idea here is that autonomy is culturally based, but within our culture, it involves, and it's not just either or. It's not you have autonomy or you have none. It's a continuum, kind of how we just saw on the Maasai example. But the idea here is that the parents come to view their children as increasingly adult-like. They allow more autonomy. They allow more control of their lives, and that relationship becomes more equal. And this is, in the United States context, is most associated with authoritative parenting, but in other cultures, authoritarian and permissive styles also produce acceptable outcomes. Peer influence. Peers typically do more to foster important social learning and positive behavior than to encourage antisocial behavior. Getting in trouble by conforming to peers is less likely among adolescents who have secure attachment to warm and authoritative parents and are neither too lax nor too strict. So peers are important for development, and we'll go into more reason why momentarily, but they do more, in general, for social learning and positive outcomes than antisocial behavior. And in the United States, in particular, in our particular culture, authoritative parenting leads to more positive peer relationships. Or I should say contributes to the likelihood of more positive peer relationships. Friendships. Friendships change with age. Adolescents increasingly choose friends who match their psychological qualities, that is, their interests, their attitudes, their values, and their personalities. Same-sex friendships are emotionally intimate throughout adolescence. Cross-sex friendships begin in the 11th grade. Early childhood, friendships are based around just enjoying common activities. Late childhood is about mutual loyalty and caring, and adolescent is about intimacy and self-disclosure. So you're seeing literally a increase in the intimacy, self-disclosure among friendships, and you're kind of actually training or practicing future romantic relationships, more intimate relationships among your peers. It's kind of like this training base, this base where you're able to again practice these social skills that will be more relevant and useful for future romantic partners. And cross-sex friendship begins in the 11th grade. So we kind of see that in the beginning of child development, kind of a cross-sex friendships, then a decline in cross-sex friendships in the United States, I should say, and then an increase in cross-sex friendships again, beginning around the 11th grade. This is on average, and these are kind of broad generalizations. Changing social networks. Dunphy, just as the psychologist, proposed how peer group structures change during adolescence to prepare for dating relationships. Late childhood same-sex groups, during late childhood, they have little interaction with the opposite sex. Eventually, boy and girl cliques begin to interact. Same-sex cliques provide a secure base for romantic relationships. That is, groups of individuals who interact frequently. So again, kind of what I was just saying, these more intimate relationships among same-sex boy groups and same-sex girl groups, broadly speaking, and historically speaking, of course, changing to varying degrees now, but just broad generalizations here, allowing for kind of increased intimacy, again, practicing those social skills and serving as a secure base, kind of like a parent serving as a secure base as a child. But in this case, peers serving as a secure base from which they can interact with the opposite sex and romantic relationships, and they can come back to their same-sex clique, their group, and then that secure base allows them to become, de-stress, kind of review, debrief, etc. In early adolescence, popular boys and girls form mixed-sex cliques. Crowds then form, which is a loose collection of mixed-sex cliques with similar characteristics, aka prototypical identities, which provides a vehicle for socializing with other sex through organized social gatherings such as parties. High school crowds lessens as couple forms. So we have these same-sex cliques. Then eventually, the popular people, they then form mixed-sex cliques. Those cliques come together. Parties begin to form, which allows for socialization among intersex socialization, which allow couples to form. And then crowds become smaller, and then couples are made. So it's kind of like this same-sex clique leading to eventual intersex clique, which eventually leads to this mixing of those intersex cliques, which then allow for relationships to form. That is the Dunphy theory. So these are just percentages of adolescents reporting romantic relationship, and obviously that number goes up with age. Dating. Adolescent romantic relationships evolve through 4 phases: initiation, status, affection, and bonding. And kind of all these phases, I should say not stages, phases, and statuses kind of take a similar trajectory. So look at initiation. Coming to see oneself as a person capable of romantic relationships. So literally allowing yourself, hey, I can actually have a romantic relationship. Status, peer approval is what counts. Having the right kind of partner is important for the status it brings in the larger peer group. So dating the most popular boy or girl in school, I'm going to look cool myself, so therefore I'm going to date this person. Affection. Late adolescence focus on the relationships rather than on self-conscious or peer status. So now I'm dating, and I'm focused less on like what that status, what being with that prom king or queen does for me, my self-concept, my status, and more on I'm more focused on the relationship. And bonding, transition to emerging adulthood, emotional intimacy achieved in the affection stage, maybe coupled with long-term commitment. So now at this stage here, we're bonding, we have emotional intimacy, and which can lead to long-term commitment. So we're going from, am I even capable of having a relationship, to all the way at the bottom to possible long-term commitment. And finally, the impacts of COVID. Among 13 and 18-year-olds of age, insurance claims increased for self-harm, overdose-related claims, substance use disorders, anxiety, major depressive disorder, and adjustment disorder. Mental health-related conditions became the sixth most common reason for emergency room visits in 2020, and were 19% higher than 2019. So insurance claims is a good proxy for mental health issues because it's also an underestimate because it's many adolescents don't have insurance because their parents don't have insurance, and thus are less likely to, or literally not likely, it's impossible to file insurance claims. So despite that, that huge, decreasing your sample because many people do not have insurance, and even if they did have insurance, they would not file a claim because they have poor insurance. But despite all that, we see increases for a host of mental health disorders and self-harm and overdose related claims. And mental health, and more visits to the emergency rooms in 2020 compared to 2019. Because of COVID-19 and school closures, I should say, more youth were not able to escape from their daily home stressors or caregiving by attending school or socializing with their friends. By being denied normal social experiences, their emotional functioning and overall development may be negatively impacted. So this gets back to kind of the COVID impacting the most vulnerable groups disproportionately. So if you have a rough home environment, have a rough neighborhood environment, school can be seen as escape for these individuals. But with school closures, that's obviously not possible right now. Also, school closures can lead to a reduction, or will lead to a reduction in normal social experiences, which could be harmful to developmental outcomes, specifically social developmental outcomes. And we saw that friendships serve as a base for dating outcomes, so maybe harmful to dating. Obviously, these are just wild speculation, and other factors may buffer that effect of COVID and for social development, or other new ways of socializing may occur, through Zoom, through, going out, playing outside more or something instead. I don't know, doing something else, gaming with your friends instead. They may not be optimal substitution, but it may be enough to prevent any, long-term social developmental issues. SAT and ACT tests, optional admission policy. A more holistic view of applicants was endorsed by the National Association for College Admission Counseling and other academics who have viewed the test as culturally biased. For many low-income and first-generation students, the standardized tests are seen as barriers for entry into college due to attending lower-performing high schools as well as not having access to expensive test preparation courses. So we talked about this in the last chapter, the history of these SAT and the ACTs, and the GREs, I should add. But for high school students, SATs and ACTs, some colleges moving away from caring about SAT and ACT scores, making them not required, or getting rid of kind of the minimum threshold that is needed for admission into their program, which may be beneficial to some first-generation students and low-income students and racial minorities students because, A, they don't have access to test preparation. So, you can spend thousands of dollars on private tutors or on classroom tutors to prepare yourself for these tests and get better at the tests, and just take it multiple times, because there are retest effects, aka you take the test multiple times and you're going to score probably better on some of those attempts. So that can be so that's a possible upside, but also at the same time, because of school disclosures, we know that with the shift to online learning, low-income and first-generation students are less likely, and racial minorities are less likely to have the technology needed for participating in online learning. So they may still be being disproportionately impacted, their educational and their learning development in high school. So while these tests may not be required, they may still be experiencing setbacks that may have to be addressed in the future by universities, by state colleges, by community colleges, trade schools, etc. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. I'll see you next week. Everyone have a great week. Goodbye.